The Alien series rose to popularity because of the movies, but as a franchise, this expanded into other areas. These include novels, toys, as well as video games. So what would happen when Gearbox Software, the developers famous for the Borderlands series, got their hands on the Alien IP? Well, you're going to have to stay tuned as we explore what went wrong with Alien's Colonial Marines. The idea of creating an Aliens-based game occurred when Brian Martell, the creative director at Gearbox Software, had a conversation with Ridley Scott, the director of the first Alien movie. Gearbox wanted to expand their gaming portfolio by working with an existing IP, and Ridley Scott encouraged Martell to approach 20th Century Fox in order to gain a licensing agreement for the Alien franchise. Well, it just so happened that Sega had purchased the rights to publish Aliens-based games. This meant that Martell would have to approach Sega in order to strike a deal, but Sega was receptive to Gearbox's idea for a game, and because of their experience with FPS titles, it made sense to make another FPS set within the Aliens world. The game would also be a sequel to Aliens, which is the second movie in the franchise for those that aren't aware. The development team as well as the writers for Gearbox were massive Alien fans, which was a benefit, but it didn't stop there. Sid Mead, a concept artist that worked on the Aliens movie, was also hired to design the spaceship that would be used in the game. Colonial Marines would be set 4 months after the events of Aliens, where a battalion of Colonial Marines would be sent to investigate the Sulaco spaceship. It would also feature a single-player campaign, co-op as well as a multiplayer mode. There were several weapons that could be utilised, aliens to do battle with, as well as an interesting plotline. The cherry on top being that the game was also an FPS, but this all sounds good. If you're an Aliens fan at the time, there was a lot of hype around this game. Believe me, I was one of those people. But the game would go in an opposite direction as soon as it entered the production phase. Production for the game started in 2007, with several studios working on the game as well as Gearbox. This is where the first issue would arise, as Gearbox decided to put their time into developing Borderlands as well as Duke Nukem Forever. The development for these games lasted until 2010, but the bigger issue here was that Colonial Marines was supposed to release in 2009. Now that was going to be incredibly difficult when no one was working on the game. A red flag would rise when Borderlands released in 2009, and it was so popular that Gearbox decided to start working on Borderlands 2 immediately, but they were in a bit of a conundrum. They still hadn't finished working on Colonial Marines, but they already wanted to make a sequel. Gearbox decided they would start working on Borderlands 2, and in 2010 Aliens was outsourced to Timegate Studios, but just bear in mind that Colonial Marines should have released a year prior in 2009. When Timegate Studios were given Colonial Marines to work on, they noticed that barely any work had even been started, and were sent a few assets as well as a lighting and shadow renderer. This meant that although they weren't starting from scratch, they barely had anything to work with. Timegate would continue working on the game until 2012, which coincidentally was the same time that Borderlands 2 was nearly finished. At this time, the writers for the story narrative hadn't even finished the script, which resulted in further delays. So, it's 2012 and the development process was back with Gearbox, but they weren't happy with the progress that Timegate had made with the game. At this point, Colonial Marines was set to release in February 2013, but the game was nowhere near ready. Gearbox couldn't ask Sega for any more extensions, considering the game had been in development for over 5 years now. This meant that Gearbox had 9 months to get the game ready for launch, but did they do it? Well, you've seen the title of the video, so it shouldn't be any surprise. Let's have a quick recap of the events leading up to the game's release. Production for Colonial Marines started in 2007 and was announced via Game Informer in 2008. The game's original release date was set for 2009, but after Gearbox laid off some employees, this left the game in a state of limbo. Gaming outlets believed that Colonial Marines had been cancelled, but this was ruled out after Gearbox showed screenshots of the game in 2010. After 2 years of delays, the game was displayed at the Electronic Entertainment Expo in 2011. Gearbox confirmed the game would launch in spring of 2012 on the PS3, Xbox 360, PC and Wii U. The game would be delayed twice more, being pushed back to February 2013. Gearbox realised they had no chance of porting the game to the Wii U, so they decided to cancel it instead. I'm sure the 10 people around the world that actually bought a Wii U were totally devastated, baby. With the game in a poor state in 2012 and Gearbox only having 9 months to finish it, it was going to be a rush job. What they didn't need were gamers complaining that there were no female characters in the game, so they had to create more player models in order to quell these complaints. Colonial Marines would finally release in February 2013. There was a collector's edition that included some in-game DLC, a power loader figurine as well as a big box case, but I can assure you the game didn't play as well as this collector's edition looked. Colonial Marines was review bombed around the world, being criticised for its graphics, technical issues as well as its overall gameplay. IGN gave it a 4.5, they stated the game just looks bad. They also pointed out that there was screen tearing, the textures were low quality and objects would be popping in more than Mary. Okay, they didn't say the last part, but I threw that in there. Eurogamer gave it a 3 out of 10. They claim the game was worse than a low-budget title that released back in 2002. So what I take from that is that Shrek Super Party is clear of Colonial Marines. Now, that's not what I'm saying, that's what Eurogamer's suggesting. Well, kinda. If you thought the game couldn't get ratioed any harder, I introduce you to Game Critics Review. Now, these guys gave the game a 2 out of 10 and stated it was horrific in all the wrong ways. They wanted to say the best part of the game was landing on a planet with everything else being a low point. They'd go on to say that the writers took the Alien script and wiped their arse with it. Whew, boy, this review escalated quickly, didn't it? These guys were clearly not impressed, but there's more. Listen to this quote. Enemy mercenaries decide seemingly at random whether to camp behind cover for months on end or cheerfully run into a hail of bullets in a suicidal attempt to take the player down. I get a feeling this guy didn't like the game. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I'm getting that feeling. Go ahead and read this guy's review in full. It's hilarious and it's worth it if you want a good laugh. It was written by Darren Foreman. Okay, so we've established that no one enjoyed the single player experience, but Colonial Marines would shine in the multiplayer mode. Well, that's what I would have said if it was any good. Xbox achievements stated it was average, less offensive and not much fun, and after playing the campaign for 8 hours, you wouldn't want to spend any more time in the game, let alone playing the multiplayer. Yes, that's right ladies and gents, Colonial Marines couldn't get a break to save its life. Colonial Marines wasn't just in the spotlight for the game's performance alone. As we touched on earlier, Gearbox was secretly working on Borderlands and Duke Nukem Forever when they were supposed to be working on Aliens. During this time, Sega were paying them on a monthly basis, and why wouldn't they be? They had an agreement in place. Well, Sega eventually caught wind of what Gearbox was doing, or should I say wasn't doing, with Colonial Marines. They decided to cancel the game, and with this lack of guaranteed revenue, Gearbox decided to fire several members of staff. Sega decided to keep the game in development, which prompted Gearbox to outsource development of the game to another studio. But even after all of this, and even being caught red-handed, Gearbox couldn't keep their hands out of the Borderlands cookie jar and continued working on that game instead. It would get even worse when a lawsuit was filed against Gearbox as well as Sega. A group of players claimed they purchased the game because of the gameplay they'd seen at an expo. However, the version of Colonial Marines they received was nothing like what they'd previously seen, and they believed they'd been falsely advertised to. But what would make them say this? Well, early demos of the game were cited as being real gameplay, having a high graphical fidelity and featuring levels that weren't actually in the game. Now, Sega, wanting to stay clear of any bad press, decided to settle the lawsuit by paying the victims $1.25 million. However, they refused to accept any legal culpability. So in other words, Sega were trying to handle this in a professional manner and move on with their lives. But Gearbox wasn't having any of that shit, no. They said the claim should be dropped against them because they're not responsible for marketing the game. That's Sega's job. So not only did they screw Sega by developing a shitty game, they also threw Sega under the bus and said it was their fault that the game was shit. Gearbox went on to say they'd spent approximately $15 million of their own capital in order to develop the game. They refuted all of the accusations against the studio, and the lawsuit was later dropped in 2015. With all of that said, how did the game sell? In the United Kingdom, it topped the charts of the Xbox 360 and PS3 and was one of the biggest releases of the year. It did alright in the United States, reaching number 6 in the charts, but how did that translate into money? Well, the game would go on to sell 1.3 million units around the world, and you may be thinking, well, that's not too bad. But when you factor in the money that Sega invested over the years, as well as Randy Pitchford's $10 million, it's safe to say the game didn't turn a profit. Well, that's the tale of Colonial Marines. And since then, there has been more Alien movies and games, and whilst not all of these ventures have been revolutionary, I believe Sega pulled the rabbit out of the hat with Alien Isolation. I completed it again recently and highly recommend it. Ladies and gents, subs and non-subs, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, you know what to do. You've heard it all a million times. All of my socials can be found in my description. And remember, I'll never be a real YouTuber until I've released an apology video. Or two. That's all, guys. Peace out.
Game over, man. It's game over.